right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I hope things are going well for you. I hope you're ready for this conversation. This was a really fun one for me. I enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoy it too. My guest today is Katrinell Davis. She is an associate professor of sociology at Florida State University. And I wanted to talk to her because I found two of her books on the University of North Carolina Press website. And they caught my eye because they linked up so powerfully with the things we try to get into on this program. Her first book is called Hard Work is Not Enough: Gender and Racial Inequality in an Urban Workspace. This book focuses on the experiences of Black women bus drivers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it gets into all those complicated intersections of politics and culture and capitalism. A lot of the stuff that we talked about on our conversation with Ann Bailey a few weeks ago. So if you want to go back to that one, a lot of similar themes. Really important stuff about the way that capitalism impacts different populations in different ways and how those populations survive and respond. And I think that theme is present in her latest book as well. Katrinell Davis's latest book is called Tainted Tap: Flint's Journey from Crisis to Recovery. This is about the Flint, Michigan water crisis. It's sort of like one of the most appalling things happening on the American scene, and that's saying something, because when you think about tap water and what that means, it's civilization, really. It's life. And what has happened to the town, the city of Flint, for decades has been an atrocity. But what's great about this book, Tainted Tap, is that it's not just about that atrocity. It offers that history, but it also offers a vision of resistance, organization, how communities and people come together to make their lives livable and to fight capitalism on the ground level. So it's really, really important stuff. And Professor Davis is from Flint, Michigan, so she has something personal to sort of relate to us in this conversation. So again, this was just a really eye-opening one. I felt like I knew what the Flint water crisis was about, but I learned a lot from this, and I hope you do too. All right, I wanted to thank my Patreon supporters for keeping this project alive, and let you know that my video lecture series on the Vietnam War called Nam TV is premiering this week. I'm very excited to share that with everybody. It's sort of my attempt to cut through decades of awful cultural and political cliches that have covered up what the Vietnam War is really about. So it's a sort of sketch, a series of sketches for what I think would be a new way of imagining this history. So I know that's kind of ambitious, but if you want to read more about the project and hopefully join up and support the project, we really appreciate it. We're totally independent organization here. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And again, thanks to all our supporters who are enjoying all our bonus episodes and interacting on the website. All right, let's get to our conversation. Here is me talking with Professor Katrinell Davis. All right, so thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I know it's the end of this semester and a weird semester, but I was just spending some time with your book over the last couple of days, your latest book, which is called Tainted Tap: Flint's Journey from Crisis to Recovery. And there are so many intense ideas in it. But I wanted to ask you just to start off about Flint and Flint as a place in the sort of wider cultural imagination, because I've told the story many times on this podcast about being a sort of like dumb white suburban kid who watched Roger and Me in a high school class, and it was the first time I'd ever thought about capitalism or any issues like that. And I really credit it with sort of like beginning my journey thinking about all this stuff. But Flint then becomes this sort of place in the imagination as this like long-suffering sort of city that's been suffering from deindustrialization and a million other issues. But I wonder, what was a story you wanted to tell about Flint with this book? Because I feel like you're doing a different thing than anything else I've seen about Flint.
Well, the first thing that you need to know about Flint is that Flint is my hometown. And so the very first thing that I see and think of when Flint is on the brain is um, family,
Mm.
church, uh, picnics, um, concerts, uh, struggle,
Mm.
hardship.
Mm.
But I also think of Flint as a place where I learned how to be resilient. We call ourselves Flintstones in Flint, and ultimately, um, what I what I know is that Flint is a fighting place. It's
Mm.
full of people who will put on some boxing gloves and go several rounds, right? And so the first thing that I noticed when the national news and folk got interested in this story is that people were victims,
Yeah.
um, and the folks in Flint are anything but victims, right? And so my story, or the story that I tell in this book, is pretty much representative of that vision of Flint.
Mm.
Uh, yes, Flint experienced a water crisis. Uh, People have been hurt by this crisis, but the people in Flint are not down for the count.
Mm.
In fact, we know about the crisis because of their effort.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the city is really being built up, and it's turning a new leaf because of the residents' effort, their collective efforts. And so the story in this book is different from what you've seen, I think, because I have a different relationship to the place. I know
Yeah.
that experience is in me. And so I don't have it in me, right, to tell a story that doesn't situate the problem as a problem of neglect.
Mm.
This isn't a problem of initiative or confusion on the part of the residents. This is a problem of neglect. And that's what I wanted to center in this piece.
Well, it seems like you've done sort of given us something that sort of shows us all sides of it. Because as much as I think it's important to resist that media narrative, which is like all about victims and trauma and like people that are just like have no agency whatsoever and are just having things done to them. I feel like that's the story that people want to tell about Flint and other places. I mean, it's just sort of we like that. So we like that narrative. It feels like in the media at least. But your story also tells like the things that have been done, like this concept of benign neglect. I think is a really important one. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? Because it seems like it's a what your story tells is the wider story than just the water crisis. It's like here's the longer story, and it seems like benign neglect is sort of like an important concept to understand, like what exactly happened in Flint and why the water crisis is like a symptom of something bigger.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And by the way, thank you for having me. I don't think I had the opportunity to say that, or I didn't take the opportunity to say that. Essentially, benign neglect really speaks to, especially when we're situating that concept within the urban space or within uh, the built space. We're really talking about the neglect of communities, and not necessarily the neglect that goes into not making sure that kids have good books, right, or up to date books. We're not just talking about school sizes. We're talking about schools that have leaded pipes that in their drinking fountains. We're talking about 911 calls that don't get picked up. We're talking about streets that never get fixed, right? So people are tearing up their cars just trying to go to work. We're talking about snow that doesn't get picked up or plowed, and it's several feet, right? We're talking about a city primarily being in a space where, it's full of working class and increasingly poor people, and many city services can't be covered, right, or aren't being covered as they should, primarily because the tax base isn't really covering those expenses, right? In addition to that, states like Michigan have a history of supporting cities in dire straits by coming up with a revenue sharing arrangement. In the past years, the state of Michigan took away a lot of the money that the city of Flint would ordinarily get to fund their city services, et cetera. And so we have benign neglect, not starting in 2014, but starting somewhere in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
When we decided we were going to leave people behind, right? We made that decision. We made the decision not to address things like homelessness. We just decided to erase it from the urban space. Let's put them in some sort of shelter. Oh, and by the way, not enough rooms, beds, etc. But we're doing what we can do. And so we've grown beyond that space, right? Where we're simply just packing up and leaving communities. We are in a space where services that they typically would have, they don't have. And this has been ongoing, I should note, for many decades. Right?
I was going to say,
it's like the gift that's been that keeps giving, right? But we haven't really sort of said, okay, let's stop and correct any of this. So the Flint crisis is the result of, it sits on that history, right? It sits on the defunding of the city. And that's how we got that crisis. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Can you talk a little bit about that, the politics of that, and where that comes from? Because you mentioned like the Daniel Patrick Moynihan stuff, and the late 60s, 70s, deindustrialization is happening, but it seems like there's a strategy of like cutting services. Like in my head, and this is a story that's, I think, well known in part because it's connected to the history of hip hop, and people love to tell the story about the South Bronx in the 70s and 80s, a place where the services were cut, and there was like a certain sort of social deprivation that happened, and hip hop came out of that. And it feels like this is like when I read your book, I'm like, well, there's a weird romanticization of that, first of all, but also like, what is their strategy? Because it seems like it's something that is not just in New York City and the South Bronx in the 70s. It's something that's like a widespread sort of political, it's neoliberalism, right? That's sort of what we're looking at.
I love that you brought this up, my friend, okay? Because that strategy was really about, what these people are asking for too much.
like running water.
And garbage.
Yeah.
The strategy really is connected to fires in New York and how we should how should we address these fires? I think that was the question put in front of Moynihan at the time, and he was advising I think President Nixon. And essentially the recommendation was, let's just turn a blind eye, right? And if we stop giving them attention, maybe they will stop asking for it, right? And this is all happening. This is well before the 80s, when we really, lose about 70% of social welfare funding, right? This is right when we're just trying to stop this whole identity politics. We're trying to stop the momentum of the civil rights movement. And so it's important that, we connect or that we really bring out the fact that this isn't just about city budgets, trying to make sure that there are enough people in the space middle class people in the space to keep a city going. This is also about how do we solve the old problems that haven't been solved before, concerning poverty, concerning the structural effects of racism, because they're still sitting with us, but we're in a space where we kind of want to tap out. We have this piece in our culture that says, or I think there's a special place where we engage social problems, but then we say, well, there's a limit to this, right? And so in that place, we engage these problems, but we have 20 minutes, okay?
Yeah.
After 20 minutes, we have to have some sort of solution, or it all of a sudden becomes that community's problems. I'm so sorry, but I swear to God, that seems to be a pattern.
Yeah, and also like it seems like there needs to be a viral moment. I wondered about that with Flint, Michigan, with the water crisis specifically. Like, there's no viral video that comes out of it. There's no like moment that the media can latch onto, and it seems like that. There's a sort of like eventual turning away from that. But it's also like hearing you say that it reminds me of something we bring up a lot on this show is like the Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in the popular imagination is a lot about sort of like, my little boy and little girl can play on the playground sort of together. And that sort of like economic radical that King was, especially towards the later years of his life, is something we forget entirely or intentionally sort of forget. And it seems like it goes a little bit of what you're saying. It's sort of like a limit to how far we can talk about this issue.
We don't, you're right. We talk about his dreams, right? But we don't talk about why he died.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets at it, and where do we go from here? Was it crisis or chaos or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
He was in a space where he began to understand that we needed to pair this call for decency with the call for, a good paying job. For respect. And he began to understand that he needed to link up with those younger folk, and really put some respect on some of what they were saying, because their analysis was quite accurate. And so you're absolutely right. We pick and choose what we like to talk about.
Well, and class has a lot to do with what we don't want to talk about. But I wonder if, like, just in terms of the story of Flint, and how that fits in here, like, because when I'm reading your book, I'm thinking, well, this is sort of like a continued picture of the civil rights movement or the Black freedom struggle, whatever you want to call that we tend to locate in the 60s and 70s. How is that related to what happened in Flint? Because it seems like it's part of what your story is telling, is a story of resistance and people like getting together in different ways and saying like, no, we're going to do something about this. But there are lots of different ideas about what that is, I guess, if that makes sense.
I love that you chose to ask me why I situated the story there, right? In the 1960s, I started in the Model Cities era. Yeah. This is a time where the United States government said, look, we're going to go to slum-ridden areas, right? Poor areas, brown, Black areas, and we're going to try to build these areas up. Not in this time, we're not doing top-down approaches. The approach was supposed to be bottom up. So let's give people a say in their local government. Let's make the effort to make them feel safe in their communities. Let's look at the hurdles that keep them from good paying jobs. Let's look at housing circumstances, right? Mm-hmm. And so this was the mission of the Model Cities era. And it was supposed to sort of wake up the residents and get them going, create citizens councils, etc. And it did just that in Flint. Just like it did, it worked wonders in other places, but in Flint in particular, you get concerned citizen councils pop up here and there, Black clubs, people joining various supports, or rather they were joining various clubs and events in the community that were all about helping the community move forward. People were patrolling the streets, and all of these efforts were set up to build the community up, give the community a voice, let them feel as though they were central to the city's future, right? And this was part of the policy, transformative policy that we forget to talk about. Why do we forget to talk about Model Cities program, right? Well, I show, or I try to demonstrate in the book why we forget to talk about it. It was a progressive policy that did not have the backing of the social, did not have the backing of the political environment. And what do I mean by that?
Yeah.
In Flint in particular, you have the problem of structural racism. In not just structural racism, but white supremacy. You have organizations like the Mott Stewart Foundation that's committed to making sure that the city stays separate racially and across class lines. And so you get this progressive moment. People are all fired up to go. And all of a sudden, Mott isn't feeling the situation. And that's a problem because Mott is funding the Flint public school system, right? And then so you almost have no motivation within the school system to support what's happening, with this new program. You have people who are power brokers, middle-class power brokers. Oh, they're talking over those people who were elected to represent the citizens, right? Who were brought in via this Model Cities program to sit at the table and have a say. So then all of a sudden people were like, I'm not feeling this. I'm completely walking away from this because this is trash. This is garbage. This is a lie. And so you have that experience on the ground of feeling disappointed, feeling let down, right? Feeling played because you let us in, and quietly Flint residents were already plugged in to advocacy because there's a deep history of advocacy in the city. So they did nothing but wake folks up and give them some funds, right? And give them some uniforms. They were already ready to go. And so what happened, the power brokers didn't want to let the working class folk in to the decision-making process.
Yeah.
And then the structure of it all, that is the discrimination that was happening in schools, the discrimination that was happening with NGM, which I didn't describe in the book, the discrimination that was happening within the community where people were experiencing abuse and harassment from police was unchecked. And so all of these things didn't really support the conclusion that this particular program did anything positive for Flint. It did, however, put serious money into the initial founding of groups in Flint that are still, present today. And I think this moment also put us in a space where, I think there's an opportunity to say there was an effort made to do a lot of the things that people are saying that need to be done right now. Like there are things that people want to happen, neighborhood corps set up to patrol the streets because there are 4 or 5 cops, right? Hired by the city. And these are all ideas that were executed during the Model Cities era. Right?
I hear this conversation coming back. Broken windows, policing, and all. I mean, we've been through cycles of this conversation. It seems like, but it's also like, thinking about the era you're talking about, like 60s and 70s, is it like these community and 80s, like these community organizations that are sort of like trying hard to push against this like swell of capitalism that's sort of merging with the sort of liberal moment that happened in the 1960s. I don't know. It makes me think of like in California we had Prop 14 in 1964-5, which it was like a reaction from the California Real Estate Association, who were basically saying like, we need to be able to discriminate. It was to overturn something called the Rumford Fair Housing Act, but it passed 2-1 because they drummed up all this fear among white homeowners. But what I bring it up for is because it gets to Flint, and I think connects in terms of like that structural racism thing, because the California Real Estate Association was basically open about it. They were like, racism isn't something we profit off. That's sort of like a side strategy. It's the fundamental strategy of our profit making enterprise. Like segregation is being able to manipulate housing prices using fears about race and fears about neighborhoods is kind of the whole show. And they sort of revealed, I mean, that was 1964 they're saying this, and it seems like that weird cycle that we're in, like, to sort of address these issues seems like it keeps returning.
Well, it keeps returning because we don't fundamentally address the issues or the causes of the issues that we claim to care about, right? Even when you think about poverty, when you think back to our initial sort of take on, let's say, newly freed slaves, what did we say? Well, first off, we were like, if we can get them to go back to Africa, let's do that, right? And then we were like, of course, work, and we're going to coerce you to work under whatever circumstances. It can be dirty work, it could be unsanitary work or unsafe work, work, right? And so we're going to pass laws to make you work. So our first inclination was, okay, you're free, but you're going to have to work no matter what, right? And then when you can't work, guess what? You're a burden.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really divorced ourselves from that presupposition, that claim that poor people who we have responsibility for their condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know we have responsibility for their condition, but we say it's on you to, go find a farm if you can, right? Go find some place or some way to take care of yourself. But if you can't, guess what? You're a burden, and I'm going to treat you like that. And you have to know, when you look at how race people are treated, particularly Black folk are treated over time, that's a current of the story, right?
And it seems like the story that you're telling is of disposable people that have become disposable because of capitalism. Like capitalism has deemed these people disposable in a sense of they can profit off them a little bit, but their social condition is irrelevant. It seems like that's part of what's going on. And I wonder, because I want to resist like this victimhood thing too, because your story is like, your story is really it's okay, when capitalism deems you disposable or a population disposable, how does that population respond? And it seems like in Flint, you've got especially during the water crisis, a response that I don't feel like most people know the story of how people in Flint. You're right in the sense of like, we like to think of Flint as a place that's just been victimized, but how did people respond to water being? I mean, I don't know if the word poisoned is the word, but it seems like first of all, like how did it? I know this is a big story, but how did it happen that the water became this way, and how did people immediately begin to respond as they were realizing this? Because to me, it's like there's nothing more horrifying. Like, it's like, to me, the Flint water story is like one of the most outrageous things that's happened in my lifetime, really, in this country, in the United States, and something that I think a lot of people don't understand exactly how it happened.
So I'll break it down really quickly because you can write a dissertation on this, really and truly.
Right.
But what happened, the state of Michigan, under the emergency manager law, took over the city of Flint with other cities. Other cities also were taken over because they were deemed under financial distress. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that distress was caused by the state taking away its funding, or the funding that it typically would provide these municipalities. And so you get this moment where the state is under control, or has control of city operations. Basically, we sideline the mayor, the city council member. Under this situation, that the emergency manager can basically void out a union contract. And so this particular position had tremendous power. The citizens of Flint, the citizens of Michigan, fought against this particular power. However, it was reinstated by the governor. And so they were dead set on taking control of these spaces and essentially making the decision for these municipalities under distress, with the understanding or the assumption that they can't function, or they can't take care of their affairs on their own. Mm-hmm. Right. And so we're going to apply our theories and assumptions and turn things around. What happened? A decision was made to pursue getting off of Detroit water. Why? Detroit water, in the opinion of the folks in control, was too expensive, and there was a need or a growing desire at the moment, and really this desire goes back to the late 1960s, to pursue a pipeline that Flint would own on its own, right? And so there was an effort to avoid basically continuing to feed that Detroit beast when some sort of pipeline could be created to that would support Flint and also be a resource for Flint. All that said, decisions were made, and what the state attempted to do was make it look like, well, the people, or at least the city council, approved of the decision to go on the get off of the Detroit water and to switch to the Flint River. And so a vote was or they had a vote, and so eventually contracts are signed that say, okay, we're going to move forward, et cetera, with this decision to go from Detroit to the Flint River, all again for the purposes of saving money and getting things back on track for the city of Flint. Now, what we didn't know was behind the scenes. In order to make that work, you kind of needed a functioning water treatment plant, because this particular water source, the Flint River, has a very, very long history of just being polluted. Everything from dead bodies, cars, I just said cars, furniture, right? It had been dumped there. Even, the city of Flint had been cited for dumping waste in this area, or in this body of water.
I don't want to interrupt, but did people know this? And how? In other words, I'm trying to picture how public and democratic a process was this.
Oh, it wasn't. It was the process of switching the water was very public, but it wasn't a democratic process, right? The people had no say. They were just being informed. The state came in and took over the city, right? The state didn't give people the right to opt out of this particular decision. It was made on their behalf. And so the city of Flint initially like, oh, they're joking. right? They're going to put us on the Flint River. This is crazy. And so that was a joke until it became reality, right?
Yeah.
End of April 2014. And then people began to see brown water coming out of their fountains, their taps, right? And they began experiencing health issues, skin problems. They began seeing neurological problems or behavioral problems among children, or children began having behavioral problems. Pets were avoiding the water, right? And so people began to be concerned and immediately began sending letters, not just to some random person. They're sending letters to the Department of Environmental Quality. They're sending letters to the President of the United States, then Barack Obama, right? They're calling regulatory officials. They're calling the City of Flint Water Department. They are contacting people because they're starting to put it together that this rash that I'm having won't go away. And it has to be connected to this brown water that smells like eggs that I can't get rid of, right? And so, and you have to know that people in the community couldn't really support folks, namely doctors, because they show up and they don't know what's happening, right? Even when the concern about the disinfectants that emerged by January 2015. Apparently, the city was having difficulties controlling the bacteria in the water, right? And so they start throwing all of this chlorine on the problem. And what does that create? A bigger problem, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, you get byproducts that are harmful to people to the point where you could cause cancer, if you consume this in large quantities and for an extensive amount of time. And so they received the note, and it wasn't, hey, Dr. Davis or Miss Davis Katrinell. It's, hey, resident, and that's if you got it, right? There's a problem that we didn't need to actually tell you about, but it's happening. We're fixing it. And if you want to know if it's a problem for you in particular, talk to your doctor. And then that's where I say people talk to their doctors, and the doctors are like, I don't know what TTHMs are, and disinfected byproducts. I don't know how they can impact humans, right? And so people had to call their own experts, right? Because the city was saying, okay, so if you have a problem, guess what? It's due to your internal plumbing. Has nothing to do with what we're doing. Mind you, at that time, what they were actually doing was choosing not to apply corrosion control. It's supposed to do the job of protecting pipes from lead, right? And so they're not really, doing what's necessary to make sure that there's corrosion control. The water treatment plant doesn't have the necessary updates to function appropriately, right? All of a sudden, people are getting these notices in the mail, and that's it. Again, if some did not receive it, and this notice told them that the water had problems. You don't necessarily need to avoid it. It's not necessarily a threat to your health, but we just wanted to tell you and check in with your doctors. And as I mentioned, doctor couldn't help them. So they ended up reaching out to water treatment experts, Aaron Brockovich,
Wow. I was going to say, this reminds me of Aaron Brockovich, weirdly enough, but
they went there.
That's the
They
story,
went
though.
there.
I mean, it actually reminds me of a lot of different things over the years of like this sort of like when the government, when the state is practicing this kind of neglect. I mean, people have to figure out a way to sort of address that one way or the other. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
do people leave Flint? I feel like a lot of people would want to leave, and is it a strategy of making them leave? Because it seems like that's part of what, what this is
Okay.
too.
Well, the people who had the capacity to leave did leave Flint.
Right.
We do know that Flint was probably just under 100,000 people when this process began, right? They're about at 80,000 now,
Mm.
right?
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And so people certainly left. Um, I think the community is split. And I'm reporting on the community's take because I don't live there and I don't think I have the right
Hmm.
to say
Hmm.
what exactly is going on. I can report on what I know. And so here's my report,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The community believes two things. One, there's a belief that folks are being pushed out. There's been this long-standing take that the power brokers in the city would like to turn Flint into a college town. You got, these various different universities in the area, and it would probably be a great fit. There's always been a connection to the downtown area and making sure that it has its updates, etc.
Mm.
And so that said, in the shadow of those updates, we've seen um, neglect.
Yeah.
Communities not seeing development improvements for years,
Hmm.
and so the take is that what's happening, you change the laws that enable the state to get the land quicker from people who are behind in taxes, right?
Hmm.
You create a land bank that's supposed to, in some way, help people buy land cheaper, right? Help communities. It's also a means that communities, or a way that for communities to sort of build their own co-ops or gardens, and etc. But what's happened instead, you have the land bank comes in and it buys the vacant property, and in some cases, more times than not, in certain areas of the city, the North End in particular, uh, they tear down the property. Right? It takes us back to that slum, that
Yeah.
the time when we were tearing down properties and we were calling that urban renewal.
Yep. Yeah.
Right? And so that's very much happening in Flint. And so you got those people thinking they want to exterminate us. They're trying to get rid of us, right? And they are playing a dirty game because they are willing to poison us and then charge us 3 times the amount for the water that people are paying in neighboring communities in Michigan. And in Flint, by the way, the cost of water is about 8 times the amount, the national amount. And so folks are, feeling a certain kind of way because the water has been, very problematic. Or it's we've gone from saying it's polluted to people have been exposed to lead due to the water. Let's just say it's tainted, and or it's been tainted, and it still needs to improve significantly before people can trust it as a source. But all that said, they're in a space where things can get better for residents, and so there are people who say, well, I'm not certain that this happened because the city or power brokers are trying to take the city away from the working class, poor, brown, Black folks, right? They're more like, look, get in where you fit in.
Hmm.
we can't be in this space where we are always, singing the Negro spiritual, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to be willing to make lemonade out of the situation, or rather make the best out of the situation. And so if it means setting up a store down there to support the people who are college, athletes, etc., do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It
But
sounds like a
the points
familiar
don't walk away.
split. If it sounds like a familiar split, like in the longer history of civil rights, or even the longer history of just different marginalized groups in American history and otherwise, is like how to deal with that, one way or the other. And it's like the sort of like, well, we run away and start our own community, or we try to like negotiate with whatever force is here, because what else are we going to do? It seems
Absolutely.
like one that's really it's been there for a while in terms of like it's different iterations throughout history.
Yeah, it's the fight or flight, right?
Yeah, I guess
But
so.
here's what
Yeah.
we know. Here's what we know in the literature about this. And I'm going to front load this by saying this. It's important that people that they plug in and they fight where they are. Here's why. What we know in the research is that people, even when they move for very good reasons, right? I have a better job. My apartment has an additional, bedroom. So now I can split up my kids who are always beefing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what happens, those things are great, but working class people depend on their community much more than we give them credit for, right? So they depend on old girl up the street to braid their little girl's hair. They depend on the person up the road that's going to pay for their, basically, so give them some sort of loan.
Mm-hmm.
People watch each other's kids. They
You're talking about social capital, right?
Yeah, social
Yeah,
capital,
right.
capital. But what I'm talking about, I'm trying to get at the sort of concrete things that we don't give folks credit for. That's why I'm struggling here, because it's almost like common sense on some level.
Yeah.
That you need a community, but we don't always expect poor people to have one and then have a community that they actually can depend on.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really the case. We tend to demonize their social capital, and in particular their cultural capital, and we say it's not good enough. But what's happening is it is what they have, right? And so when they move, they end up, in some cases, they're 20 more minutes away from church. So now they think about finding another church home, and church was everything, because that was the connection to the after school program. That was, your the automotive person, or you had some kind of problem with your car. You had somebody at church that could fix it. It's really, we disconnect people, and we think, or rather we offer them the option to leave, right? We say, why don't you just go?
Yeah. There's your answer. Well, why not?
It's better up the street for you, right? You have more people that look like you. They cook your food. But that's not always convenient, right? When people live where they live, they often live where they live because they want to. And there are some places like a Flint, like a Detroit, like Youngstown, etc., where people don't want to leave, and they shouldn't be forced to leave because somebody else wants their land, right? Somebody else want to make money where they lay their heads. That's not right.
Mm-hmm.
And so this story in Flint is really about people saying, you know what? You're not going to take everything from me, from us. We're going to push back. We're going to fight back. And we're going to keep doing it until you actually do what you're supposed to do. The interesting thing in all of this, we were all wearing our Flint Matters, shirt, Life Matters shirt.
That's right. Yeah.
But we hopped on Google. And by 2016, Google told us, Dr. Google said the Flint crisis was over. We was like, boom, it's over. Do you know the residents had to sue the state and the city to begin the pipeline replacement program?
If you go to Wikipedia right now, Wikipedia says the Flint crisis is in the past. It's a historical moment that ended in 2019.
Oh, yeah. But the water was clear in 16, and somehow the circumstances have been resolved, right? Such that we can say by 2019, we think that, well, they had several phases of the water line replacement program, so must be solved, right?
It's still the Flint. It's still the Flint River water, though, right?
No, they switched over, I believe, in 2015.
Ah, okay.
The switch, and so residents initially they thought all we had to do was make sure that everybody else knew what was going on. If other folks knew what was happening, this problem would be corrected, and we could go on with our lives. And so people found out that the issue was happening. The water was changed back, right? We got off of the river water back to Detroit. But now you have the problem that the state started, right? When you neglect, now we're going beyond neglecting actual people and the services they need. Now we're neglecting water pipes. Now this is interesting because somebody should have said this. We could jack up a whole system. Somebody should have said that. Right? Turns out they didn't. So,
whoops.
Exactly. You got a situation in Flint that won't turn off like a spigot. It's going to take some time to heal the mistrust.
Yeah.
To really, really, and truly clean up the water distribution system. And this is not just pulling up lead service pipes, but it's also, let's deal with the water main breaks that are prevalent and consistent and that contribute to water quality, right? Water quality problems. And then I have to say this. It should be known that Flint was a high risk area or environment for lead contamination to begin with. Right. And so I think we can test the water and we can bank on the city to test it in particular places or in places where it's confident that the result will be whatever it needs to be, right? But until that city is right-sized, the infrastructure is right-sized, until people are really allow the opportunity to see their internal plumbing removed if need be, until people gain access to the mental health supports or evaluations they need, until we do better to make sure that spaces in Flint have access to healthy food, right? Particularly given what we know about the impact of lead and what's needed over time to sort of suck that up and turn things around for the kids. Things won't get better.
Yeah.
They just won't. And so what we have right now is a circumstance where many lead service lines have been dug up. Some are still down, right? The city still has not declared the water clean and clear. The state has discontinued its free bottled water giveaways. Residents can infrequently access water filters. When they need to get water, I'm told you have to go to the store. Things are there are still things in Flint that need to be fixed. That said, the other thing that residents will tell you is that they are not beaten and they won't be forgotten. So this settlement on the table may actually have legs, right? And in some cases, in many cases, adults who don't have property, they won't get anything. And in a lot of these the claims will be limited to $1,000 for years of
Wow.
tainted water. Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Wow. But I mean,
there's
that's the message that you talk a lot about in your book. I mean, your book opens with this really very recognizable, living in New York City, very recognizable story of like going to a grocery store, and like going to a grocery store that's in your neighborhood, the closest one, and it's just like the shittiest grocery store you could possibly imagine. And then like, walking or driving to like a further place, and it's just like, it's such a story of like, it's such a real story of like, this is how everyday people, we can talk about the big structures of capitalism and racism and everything else that produce that.
Yeah.
But the reality is the grocery store sucks in my neighborhood. So I go to a different one, and it seems like there's something very real about that. There's something that I really appreciate that about your book.
Hey, that's what I want it to be. I'm a social change scholar. I did not find my way in this field until I found that orientation, right?
Yeah.
And it's because it's really representative of my stance throughout my academic career. It's like I've always felt as though I need to see real people on these pages and stop lying about who they are. Stop. Okay. And so that really gets to me. But in my work, the research I do, the teaching I do, I really try to connect to people and connect to real problems, because those are the things that real people are contending with. All the rest of this shit is really neither here nor there. Yeah. And that's the reality I think that we have to confront, particularly those of us who have this, we have this sort of this take that we're really trying to save people, right? So if you're trying to save people, or you really want to protect people and build them up, speak in their language. Speak directly to them, right? Don't talk down to them. Don't try to take over their movement because you joined one day. You dig? That's crazy. We have big problems with our egos primarily. But there's a need to center the real experiences of people. And if we do that, I think we have the capacity to learn more about, what's really going on and how to fix it. Yeah. Case in point, one example I'll give you. Here I am interviewing my bus drivers for my first book, right? And I had gone to Berkeley's transportation library. I thought that I had it down pat. And I knew exactly what these bus drivers were going through. Split shifts. They were dealing with high rates of absenteeism for some odd reason, right? And so my job when I interviewed them, when I hopped on the bus, was to ask them about their experience with those things that just kept showing up in the literature, like it was those were the only things that were concerning the workers. And so when I spoke to people, I was shocked, but it was a good shock because I was supposed to be shocked. My interview method allowed me to be shocked. And that's another thing we got to do. But at any rate, I how's it going? Oh, my back hurt. I'm like, Tell me more about that. And that's how I got to the meat of the book. Hard work is not enough. And that's about how work conditions can, create harm. And sometimes those work conditions aren't unintentional.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, I want to say the name of that.
We have to be real about that and be honest about, put a circle around that. Sometimes employers allow circumstances to exist that hurt workers, and then they punish them for not showing up. So that takes me back to that comment about absenteeism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I asked the workers about their experiences. I centered their experiences. I was able to learn more about the real conditions that shaped sick offs, high absentee rates, and in some cases, terminations, right? We have to be able to do this more in our research. We, and I don't think that we have to call it public sociology in order for that to be a norm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we call it social history in the history discipline in terms of like the lived experience. And that was always, it was always like the only thing that appealed to me in graduate school, beyond the I don't know. I feel like in social history too, like the oral histories and things like that, academics tend to highlight the voices that they want to highlight, if that makes sense, or it's kind of like, well, this working class person didn't say what I expected them to say, so that doesn't go in the book because it doesn't fit the particular point I'm trying to make. We had someone on a couple weeks ago named Ann Bailey who writes about queer and women of color steel workers and long haul truck drivers, and it was very similar in terms of I don't know. I want to say the name of your book because your book that you mentioned, your previous book is called "Hard Work Is Not Enough: Gender and Racial Inequality in an Urban Workspace," and it focuses on bus drivers in San Francisco. Is that right?
That's right.
And particularly Black women bus drivers in San Francisco, and it makes me think of that wider history, which is that I don't know. It makes me think like Flint with General Motors, right? Like General Motors at some point, for better or worse, was an institution that was providing a sort of working class sort of life that isn't there anymore, and then these shitty service jobs become what people are doing, and it's the marginalized populations that, of course, are going to be the ones that are now welcomed into these service jobs. It seems like that. In other words, I'm trying to link your first book to your second book because it seems like the two issues are really, really related. In terms of the larger story of how certain populations are being pushed into certain types of jobs and more, I don't know, degrading types of employment.
Oh, absolutely. We've seen changes in the structure of opportunity available to basically all workers, right? We've seen people with master's degrees increasingly receive pink slips.
Mm-hmm.
This is very different from the types of employment relationships that used to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the case of academia, right? Even though there's been an ebb and flow over time with regard to the specific to demand for certain fields. You can go back to the 70s, but usually that's corrected itself, right? Mm-hmm. But now we have a whole adjunct professor, club, right? Yeah. So things have changed. And so what folks should know is that things have really changed for the people who are in entry-level positions. In many cases, we know that we live in a country where our health insurance is connected to our job.
Yeah.
And so now we have a whole contingent of people who are involuntary part-time workers who are in many cases priced out of the premium that's offered to them. And so
Mm-hmm.
employers say, oh, we're offering you this, but you're not, we offer it, but people just aren't taking up our health insurance. Well, it's because you make it expensive for the part-time folk and somewhat inexpensive for people who are salaried or full-time workers. In addition to that, we also know that workers, entry-level workers, are increasingly subject to being surveilled. They're getting less money for their efforts, right? And a lot of folks are dying and being injured on the job. And so we have this take that, if you want to pull yourself up from your, by your bootstraps, or if you want to pull yourself up, you need to work hard and commit your best to that effort. And what I wanted to show in that book was that among this particular population of Black women who signed up to work hard, they ran into a brick wall. It's because you have those circumstances that I just talked about, which are structural, and that's sort of everywhere, right? But then in addition to that, you have certain spaces, certain firms that have a history of not wanting certain people in their building, not wanting to employ a certain population. And so even though there are open doors, right, and this employer is getting money, right, to employ these workers, okay, they're not welcome. And those assumptions that they feel, i.e. you're not dedicated, you're not committed, you're not competent, we're hiring from the unemployable lines, right? Those assumptions shape employment practices or workplace practices, workplace norms. And then people catch hell, and then they're blamed for not being able to endure difficult circumstances. And so I'm all about working class folk having to endure circumstances. I'm all about putting a mirror up, not to the people who are enduring or dealing with the circumstances, but to the institutions that are, hemming folks up. So I'm that person that, I'll tell the story of folks dealing with some tough stuff, but I'm going to talk about how institutional actions matter.
Thank you so much for doing such a beautiful job, I think, of summarizing a lot of the big points you make in both of your books. This is really fun.
Cool.
Maybe fun isn't the right word, because so much of what we're talking about here is like the challenge. You know what I mean? Like, this is the challenge, and I like the way you lay it out. I like the way that in both of your books there seems to be an idea that this isn't a story that you tell and it's over. It's a lens in on a process that we're all part of. And Flint is such an incredible lens on all that stuff. But thank you. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I appreciate being invited to talk about Flint. Whenever we can talk about Flint and share not only its the difficult stories, but also its triumphs, I'm always up for that. So thanks for having me.
All right, that is going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Katrinell Davis, and I also want to say the names of her books. They're called Hard Work Is Not Enough, Gender and Racial Inequality in an Urban Workspace, and her latest book is called Tainted Tap, Flint's Journey from Crisis to Recovery. I cannot recommend them enough, and they are out from our friends over at the University of North Carolina Press. So thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff and support our project and get access to my new video lecture series, Nom TV, on the memory of the Vietnam War in American culture and politics, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And we'll talk to you again very soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.